Upon leaving prison, he went to visit his girlfriend's grave. When he leaned over the headstone, the January air was sharp, carrying the kind of chill that sliced straight through Anthony's thin jacket. He shivered as he walked up the gravel path of Green Hill Cemetery, clutching a small bouquet of white lilies in his trembling hands. The prison-issued boots he still wore crunched loudly against the frosty ground. Each step felt heavier than the last. 5 years. That's how long it had been since the world he knew was torn apart. 5 years since Hannah's death, or so he'd been told. The cold granite stones lining the cemetery seemed to mock him with their permanence. They hadn't suffered, hadn't changed. But Anthony, he was a different man now, scarred and worn, carrying the weight of guilt and regret. The grave wasn't hard to find. It was in the newer section of the cemetery, the grass still sparse and patchy around the headstones. He stopped when he saw her name, Hannah Marie Vieira, born August 17, 1995, died May 3, 2018. He stared at the dates for a long time. Something didn't feel right. His mind reeled, trying to connect the pieces. Hannah was born in 1995, that was right, but she wasn't supposed to be 23 when she died. She would have been 22. Anthony crouched down, tracing the engraved letters with his fingers. The stone felt cold, lifeless, and wrong. He placed the lilies gently against the base of the headstone and rose, glancing around the cemetery. The world felt too still, as though holding its breath. A middle-aged woman in a dark coat approached, her heels clicking softly against the path. She carried a clipboard and wore a distracted expression, probably an administrator. "Excuse me," Anthony said, his voice hoarse. "Can I ask you a question about this grave?" The woman paused, scanning him with polite disinterest. "Of course," she replied, shifting the clipboard under her arm. "This headstone," he said, gesturing toward it, "it's Hannah Vieira's grave, but are you sure she's actually buried here?" Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Anthony hesitated. "The dates don't add up, and I just need to know if she's here, if she was really buried." The woman tilted her head, clearly trying to decide if he was serious. After a moment, she sighed. "Wait here," she said briskly, and headed toward a small office near the entrance. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Anthony felt his pulse pounding in his ears, his breath visible in the frigid air. When the woman returned, her expression had shifted to one of mild concern. "There's no record of a burial for Hannah Vieira," she said, her voice quieter now. "This headstone was placed here, but we never received remains to inter." Anthony blinked. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying there's no body buried here," she said, lowering her voice. "As far as our records go, this plot is empty." His heart hammered in his chest. This couldn't be right. He stared at the headstone again, his mind racing. Was it some kind of clerical error? A mix-up? Or, God help him, something worse? The woman adjusted her clipboard, glancing at him as though she expected him to say something. But Anthony couldn't. His throat was dry, and his thoughts were spiraling. "Sir?" the woman prompted gently. "Are you all right?" Anthony cleared his throat. Yeah, I'm fine. Thanks for your help." He turned and walked away, his steps unsteady as he left the grave behind. Each breath he took felt heavier, the cold air filling his lungs like lead. Questions swirled in his mind, each one louder than the last. If Hannah wasn't buried there, then where was she? And what did that mean about everything he'd believed for the past 5 years? His phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his spiraling thoughts. He pulled it out and saw the name on the screen. Tyler Morris. Tyler was a cop, one of the few friends Anthony had left. They hadn't spoken much since Anthony's release, but the timing felt almost too convenient. Anthony hesitated, then swiped to answer. "Tyler," he said, his voice low. "Anthony," Tyler replied. "I heard you're back in town. We need to talk." "About what?" There was a pause on the other end. "About Hannah." Anthony's grip on the phone tightened, his knuckles turning white. He stopped in the middle of the cemetery path, his pulse quickening. "What about Hannah?" His voice was sharp, teetering between hope and suspicion. "You're not going to believe me if I tell you over the phone," Tyler said. "Meet me at O'Malley's in an hour. You know the place?" "Yeah, I know it. Anthony replied. O'Malley's was a small, worn-down diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place locals frequented for greasy breakfasts and stale coffee. Good. See you there. Tyler hung up before Anthony could ask anything more. He stared at the phone in his hand, the screen dark now, his reflection faintly visible. Tyler's cryptic words echoed in his mind, stirring a mixture of dread and curiosity. So after a final glance at the headstone, he turned and made his way back to the cemetery gate, the lilies he'd placed already dusted with frost. The bell above the door jingled as Anthony stepped inside. The smell of frying bacon and burnt coffee hit him immediately, mixing with the faint scent of bleach from the freshly mopped floors. The place hadn't changed much since he'd last been there. A couple of cracked vinyl booths, a jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked in years, and an old TV mounted on the wall playing muted sports highlights. Tyler was already waiting in a corner booth, a steaming mug of coffee in front of him. He looked up as Anthony approached, his dark eyes narrowing slightly. Tyler had aged in the 5 years Anthony had been gone. The lines around his eyes were deeper, and his once close-cropped hair was beginning to grey at the temples. "Anthony," Tyler said, standing to shake his hand. His grip was firm, his expression unreadable. "Tyler." Anthony slid into the booth across from him. "What's going on? What do you know about Hannah?" Tyler leaned back, his jaw tightening. He glanced around the diner as if to ensure no one was listening, then leaned forward. "Something's not adding up," he said quietly. "I've been looking into it ever since I heard you were getting out. That grave? It's a fake. And not just the grave. The whole story about the accident." Anthony stared at him, trying to process the words. "What do you mean, fake? Are you saying she's alive?" Tyler sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm saying the evidence doesn't make sense. The accident report said she was identified on site, but the body they found didn't match her description. They claimed it was an ID mix-up, but the whole thing was rushed. Almost like someone didn't want it looked into." Anthony felt a surge of anger rising in his chest. Who wouldn't want it looked into? Tyler hesitated, then said, "Her father." "Charles," Anthony spat, the name bitter in his mouth. Memories of Charles Vieira flooded back, his cold, calculating demeanor, the way he always seemed to look at Anthony like he was dirt under his shoe. "Yeah," Tyler said. "Charles had the resources to make this kind of thing disappear. But here's the thing. I've been digging into his records. There's more to him than just money and power. He's got connections to some shady stuff, shell companies, bribes, even ties to a couple of missing persons cases. And now I'm starting to think Hannah's disappearance wasn't an accident at all." Anthony leaned forward, his hands balled into fists on the table. "If you think she's alive, tell me where she is." "I don't know yet," Tyler admitted. "But I've got a lead. A name came up in one of the reports, Jack Bowers. He used to work for Charles. If anyone knows what happened, it's him." "Where do I find him?" Anthony demanded. Tyler hesitated. "That's the thing. Jack's gone off the grid. But I've got an idea of where he might be hiding. It's risky, though. If Charles finds out we're digging into this—" "I don't care," Anthony interrupted. His voice was low but filled with determination. "If Hannah's alive, I need to know, whatever it takes." Tyler studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but you need to be ready for whatever we find. This isn't just about her. If what I'm uncovering is true, Charles is hiding a lot more than just her disappearance." Anthony's jaw tightened. "I've spent 5 years in hell. Whatever comes next, I'll handle it." Tyler smirked faintly, the closest thing to a smile Anthony had seen from him in years. "Then let's get to work." The cold night air bit at Anthony's face as he left the diner, Tyler's words echoing in his mind. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope, but it was tangled with anger, fear, and a growing determination to uncover the truth. Hannah was out there, and Anthony wasn't going to stop until he found her. Anthony barely slept that night. The flickering light from a single lamp in his small apartment cast shadows on the walls, but his mind wasn't in the room. It was at Green Hill Cemetery, at O'Malley's, and in every dark corner of the past 5 years where he hadn't dared to hope. By the time dawn broke, he was ready to follow Tyler's lead. Tyler's car smelled faintly of fast food and stale coffee as Anthony climbed into the passenger seat. Maps and papers cluttered the console, some marked with circles and notes scribbled in red ink. Tyler had clearly been obsessing over this for a while. "You've been busy," Anthony remarked, glancing at the mess. "I don't like loose ends," Tyler said simply. He handed Anthony a folder. Inside were copies of police reports, coroner's notes, and photos from the scene of the accident. Anthony frowned, flipping through the documents. "This is it? This is all they had?" "Pretty much," Tyler said, steering the car onto the main road. "Notice anything strange?" Anthony scanned the files again. At first glance, everything seemed routine. Skid marks, debris, a charred vehicle. But then he saw it. A single line in the coroner's report stood out. Identification based on personal effects, no DNA testing conducted. "They didn't confirm it was her," Anthony said, his voice tightening. "Exactly." Tyler tapped the steering wheel. They relied on her purse and ID, both of which could have been planted. And get this, the accident happened on a back road, no witnesses, no security cameras. The other victim, the one they did identify, a woman with no family and no connections, almost like she was the perfect substitute. Anthony's jaw clenched. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they painted was infuriating. "And Jack Bowers?" Tyler nodded toward the glove compartment. "There's an address in there, an old motel out in Waterville. He used to stay there when he worked for Charles. If he's hiding, it's as good a place as any to start." Anthony pulled the paper out and stared at the address. Waterville was an hour away, a small, forgotten town nestled in the shadow of a defunct factory, the kind of place people went to disappear. The motel was exactly as Anthony expected, run down, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. A neon sign buzzed faintly in the daylight, the word vacancy flickering erratically. Tyler parked at the far end of the lot, away from the entrance. "We go in together. Let me do the talking," he said, slipping his badge into his pocket. Anthony nodded, though his patience was wearing thin. Every second spent waiting felt like a second wasted. Inside, the motel smelled of mildew and stale cigarettes. The receptionist, a bored-looking man in his 50s, barely glanced up from his TV. "Need a room?" he asked, monotone. "We're looking for someone," Tyler said, flashing his badge. "Jack Bowers. He's been staying here, hasn't he?" The man stiffened slightly, his eyes darting toward a hallway. "Room 14, he muttered, then added, "He's not much trouble, but don't tell him I sent you." "Noted," Tyler said, motioning for Anthony to follow. Room 14 was at the end of the hall, the door paint chipped and the number barely hanging on. Tyler knocked sharply. A rustling sound came from inside, followed by silence. Tyler knocked again, louder this time. "Jack Bowers, this is the police. Open up." The door creaked open a fraction, and a bloodshot eye peered out. "What do you want?" a gruff voice demanded. "We need to talk," Tyler said firmly. "I don't got nothing to say to cops." "You will if you know what's good for you," Tyler shot back. "We're not here about you. We're here about Hannah Vieira." The door opened a little wider, revealing a wiry man in his 60s. His face was lined with years of hard living, and his hands shook slightly as he gestured for them to come inside. The room was small and cluttered, the air thick with the smell of stale beer. Jack sat heavily on the edge of the bed, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "You shouldn't be asking about Hannah," he muttered. "Why not?" Anthony demanded, stepping forward. "What happened to her? Where is she?" Jack looked up, his bloodshot eyes locking onto Anthony's. "She's alive," he said flatly. "But if you care about her, you'll drop this right now. Charles doesn't play games. He'll come after you and her if he finds out you're sniffing around." "Charles made her disappear, didn't he?" Anthony pressed. "Because of me. Because she was pregnant." Jack flinched, and the silence that followed was all the confirmation Anthony needed. "Where is she?" Anthony demanded again, his voice rising. Jack hesitated, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I don't know exactly. Last I heard, he sent her out west. New identity, new life. He's got people who handle this kind of thing. But if you want to find her, you'll need more than just my word. You'll need proof, something to connect the dots." Anthony's frustration boiled over. "That's not good enough. You worked for him. You had to know where she was going. Jack held up his hands defensively. Look, I don't know much, but I know one thing. Charles didn't do this just to keep her safe. He did it to protect himself. If you want answers, you'll have to dig deeper and be ready to fight dirty. Charles has power, and he's not afraid to use it. Tyler placed a hand on Anthony's shoulder, a silent signal to back off. We'll find her, he said firmly. But we'll need your help. Start talking. Everything you know. Jack sighed, slumping back against the headboard. All right, he muttered. But you didn't hear any of this from me. Jack lit a cigarette with shaky hands, the smoke curling around his face as he sat hunched on the bed. He looked at Tyler, then at Anthony, and sighed heavily as though the weight of what he was about to say could crush him. I worked for Charles Vieira for 20 years, Jack began, his voice low and hoarse. I saw things no one should see. When it came to Hannah, Charles had one rule: keep her under control. That man's reputation meant more to him than his own family. And when she got pregnant, Jack trailed off, shaking his head. Anthony leaned forward, his knuckles pressed into his knees. What did he do? Jack's eyes flicked to Anthony, full of something resembling pity. He snapped, said it was the ultimate betrayal. He'd spent years grooming her to be the perfect daughter, the perfect heir, and then she goes and falls for you. Anthony's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. Jack continued. When she told him about the baby, he lost it. At first he wanted her to get rid of it, but Hannah refused. She stood her ground, told him she loved you and that she was keeping the baby. A small spark of pride flickered in Anthony's chest, but it was quickly snuffed out by Jack's next words. Charles didn't care. He said if she wouldn't cooperate, he'd make her disappear. Said it was better for everyone if the world thought she was dead. He had the connections to pull it off. Money, favors, people in high places. That's when he hired me to manage things. Tyler crossed his arms, his voice sharp. What does that mean exactly? Jack exhaled a plume of smoke, avoiding their eyes. It means I was the one who set up the accident, found a woman who looked enough like Hannah, paid her off and made sure she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I planted Hannah's ID and made sure the police wouldn't ask too many questions. Anthony shot to his feet, his fists clenched. You killed someone for him? She didn't die in the crash, Jack said quickly. She was already dead when I put her in the car. OD'd. It wasn't clean, but it got the job done. Tyler stepped between them as Anthony advanced. Sit down, he said firmly, giving Anthony a warning look. Jack took another drag of his cigarette, unfazed. After the accident, Charles sent Hannah out west. She didn't have a choice. He kept her under lock and key until the baby was born, then moved her to a town called Pine Creek. Gave her a new name, new papers, made her promise to stay out of sight or he'd hurt you and the baby. The room fell silent, Jack's words hanging in the air like smoke. Do you know where in Pine Creek? Tyler asked. Jack shook his head. No, I was out of the picture by then, but if she's still there, she's probably under close watch. Charles doesn't leave loose ends. Anthony sat back down, his head spinning. Why are you telling us this now? Jack stubbed out his cigarette, his hand trembling. Because I'm tired, he said simply. Tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of living with what I've done. And maybe, just maybe, I want to make things right before it's too late. Anthony leaned forward, his voice deadly calm. If you're lying... I'm not, Jack interrupted, meeting Anthony's gaze. You want the truth? That's it. Hannah's alive, and you've got a kid out there. But if you go after her, you'd better be ready for a fight. Charles won't let you take her away without a war. The car was silent as Tyler and Anthony left the motel and hit the road. Anthony stared out the window, his mind racing. She's in Pine Creek, Anthony said finally, breaking the silence. Maybe, Tyler replied cautiously. But we need to be smart about this. If Jack's telling the truth, Charles will have people watching her. We can't just roll in there and expect her to be waiting for us. I don't care, Anthony snapped. I've already wasted 5 years. I'm not wasting another second. Tyler glanced at him, his grip tightening on the wheel. Listen to me, Anthony. If you rush into this, you could get her hurt. Or worse. Charles doesn't just control people, he destroys them. You don't know the full extent of what he's capable of. Anthony turned to face him, his eyes blazing. Then help me. Use your badge, your contacts, whatever it takes. But I'm not stopping until I find her." Tyler sighed, the weight of the situation settling over him. "All right," he said finally. "We'll start with Pine Creek, but we do this my way, agreed?" Anthony hesitated, then nodded. "Agreed." By the time they reached the outskirts of Pine Creek, night had fallen. The small town was quiet, its streets lined with modest houses and a few scattered businesses. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, a perfect place to hide someone in plain sight. Tyler pulled into the parking lot of a small diner. "We'll start here," he said, killing the engine. "Ask around, see if anyone recognizes Hannah's description, but keep it low-key. We don't want to tip off the wrong people." Anthony nodded, his heart pounding as he stepped out of the car. Somewhere in this town, Hannah was alive, raising their child, and he wasn't leaving until he found her. The diner's bell jingled softly as Anthony and Tyler stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of fried food and strong coffee. A handful of locals sat at tables, quietly chatting or reading newspapers, their lives untouched by the chaos brewing just beneath the surface of Anthony's world. They took a booth near the back, where they could observe without drawing too much attention. Tyler signaled a waitress, a young woman with curly blonde hair and a tired smile. "What can I get you boys?" she asked, her voice polite but distant. "Just coffee," Tyler said, then glanced at Anthony, who nodded absently. As she left, Tyler leaned across the table. "We start slow, show her Hannah's picture. See if it rings any bells." Anthony pulled his wallet out and slipped a photo onto the table. It was worn and creased, a snapshot from years ago. Hannah's smile was radiant, her arms around Anthony as they stood in front of a Ferris wheel. When the waitress returned with their coffee, Anthony spoke up. "Excuse me," he said, holding up the picture. "Do you recognize this woman? She would have been here about 5 years ago, maybe under a different name." The waitress frowned, leaning closer to study the photo. Can't say I do," she said after a moment. "But you might want to ask Mrs. Jenkins. She's lived here her whole life and knows just about everyone who comes through town." "Where can we find her?" Tyler asked. "She runs the thrift shop down the street," the waitress said, pointing toward the window. "Closes at 6, though, so you'd better hurry." Anthony stood immediately, tossing a couple of bills on the table. Tyler followed, leaving the coffee untouched. The thrift shop was a cozy, cluttered space filled with racks of clothing, shelves of knickknacks, and the faint scent of lavender. Behind the counter sat an elderly woman with glasses perched on her nose, meticulously folding scarves. "Mrs. Jenkins?" Tyler asked as they approached. She looked up, her sharp eyes studying them over the rims of her glasses. "That's me. What can I do for you?" Anthony held out the photo. "We're looking for this woman. Her name might have been different, but she would have moved here around 2018. Does she look familiar?" Mrs. Jenkins squinted at the picture, then nodded slowly. "She does, actually. Came in here a few times, bought baby clothes. Seemed sweet, but she was nervous, always looking over her shoulder." Anthony's heart raced. "Do you know where she is now?" Mrs. Jenkins hesitated, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. "I haven't seen her in years. She used to rent a little house on Willow Street near the edge of town, but she disappeared one day, just up and left. No goodbye, no forwarding address." "Did she leave anything behind? Anything we could use to track her?" Tyler asked. The older woman pursed her lips, thinking. "Not that I know of, but I remember she used to write letters. She'd come in and buy stationery all the time. I thought it was sweet. Nobody writes letters anymore. Maybe she left something behind at that house." Anthony and Tyler stood in front of a small, weathered house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. The lawn was overgrown, and the windows were dark. It looked abandoned, but Anthony couldn't shake the feeling that it still held pieces of Hannah's life. The front door was locked, but Tyler easily jimmied it open with a practiced hand. "Perks of the badge," he muttered, stepping inside. The air was stale, carrying the faint scent of dust and something faintly floral. The furniture was sparse, a worn couch, a coffee table, and a crib in the corner. Anthony's throat tightened at the sight of the crib. He approached it slowly, running his hand over the wooden rails. A mobile of stars and moons hung above it, swaying slightly in the breeze from the open door. "Over here," Tyler called from a small desk against the wall. Anthony crossed the room, his heart pounding. Tyler had opened a drawer, revealing a neat stack of envelopes. Each was addressed to the same name, Hannah Marie Vieira. She was writing letters to herself, Anthony asked, confused. Tyler shook his head. Not to herself, to you. Anthony's breath caught as Tyler handed him the top envelope. His name was scrawled across the front in Hannah's familiar handwriting. With shaking hands, he opened it and began to read. Dear Anthony, I don't even know if you'll ever see this, but writing to you is the only thing keeping me sane. I wanted to tell you so many times, but I was too afraid. Afraid of what my father would do to you, to our child. He made me leave, told me it was the only way to protect you. Noah. That's his name. He's beautiful, Anthony. He has your eyes, your stubbornness. I wish you could see him. I wish we could be a family. But Charles made sure that would never happen. He keeps us under his thumb, watching my every move. I feel like a prisoner, but I won't let him control me forever. If there's a chance you're reading this, it means I've found a way out. And if that's true, I need you to know one thing. I never stopped loving you. No matter what happens, I'll find a way to make this right. Forever yours. Hannah. Anthony stared at the letter, his hands trembling. Tyler placed a hand on his shoulder. She didn't stop fighting, he said quietly. And neither should you. Anthony set his jaw, his eyes blazing with determination. We're close, he said. Closer than we've ever been. Then let's keep going, Tyler replied. But as they turned to leave, neither of them noticed the black SUV parked down the street, its tinted windows concealing the driver's face. The black SUV followed them for most of the drive out of Willow Street. Tyler spotted it first, catching its silhouette in the rearview mirror. We've got company, he muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. Anthony turned, his stomach knotting as the dark vehicle kept pace several car lengths behind. Charles, he said, the name bitter in his mouth. Probably, Tyler agreed. But we can't confirm anything yet. Let's not lead them straight to anything important. Tyler abruptly turned off the main road onto a side street, weaving through back alleys and suburban intersections. The SUV stayed with them at first, but after a few sharp turns, it disappeared from view. Satisfied they'd shaken their tail, Tyler pulled into the parking lot of a roadside motel. We'll lay low here for the night, he said. Figure out our next move in the morning. Inside the modest motel room, Anthony sat at the small desk, the stack of Hannah's letters spread out before him. Each one told a story of survival, of defiance, of love. Hannah's words painted vivid pictures of her life in Pine Creek. Quiet days spent caring for Noah, moments of fear whenever one of Charles's men appeared to check in, and dreams of the life she'd been forced to leave behind. But it was the details Anthony clung to, the little things that might lead them to her. She mentioned a park, he said, reading aloud from one letter. Sunset Park. Said it was Noah's favorite place to play. Tyler nodded, taking notes. That's good. It gives us a place to start asking questions, Anthony continued, scanning another page. And this, she talks about a church, St. Mary's, says it was the only place where she felt safe. That's 2 leads, Tyler said. We hit both tomorrow, but for now, get some rest. You're no good to her or the kid if you're running on empty. Anthony nodded reluctantly, folding the letters and tucking them into his jacket. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Hannah's face, or worse, Charles's smug smile. They started at Sunset Park, a small green space with a playground and a walking trail. Mothers pushed strollers, kids chased each other across the grass, and an older couple walked hand in hand. Tyler approached a woman sitting on a bench with a toddler. He flashed his badge and asked if she'd seen anyone matching Hannah's description. She used to come here, the woman said after a moment of thought. Her little boy loved the swings. Haven't seen her in a while though, months maybe. Did she ever say anything about where she was going? Tyler asked. The woman shook her head. No, but she seemed anxious, like she was always looking over her shoulder. Their next stop was St. Mary's Church, a modest white building with a tall steeple. Inside, the air was cool and still, lit by sunlight streaming through stained glass windows. A priest greeted them near the altar, his kindly face creasing with concern as Tyler showed him Hannah's picture. Yes, he said, nodding. I know her. She came here often, usually with her son. She said it was the one place she felt at peace. Anthony's chest tightened. Did she tell you why? The priest hesitated, then gestured for them to follow. In a small office behind the sanctuary, he opened a drawer and pulled out a small envelope. She left this, he said, handing it to Anthony. She told me to give it to you if you ever came looking for her. Anthony stared at the envelope, his name written on it in Hannah's handwriting. He opened it with trembling hands and pulled out a short note. Anthony, if you found this, then you're closer than I ever thought possible. I've been forced to move again. Charles's men are watching me more closely now, but I won't stop fighting to keep Noah safe. If there's any way to reach you, I'll find it. But if you find me first, please don't let Charles take him. All my love, Hannah. The priest cleared his throat. There's something else you should know. A few weeks ago, a woman came here with a little boy. She didn't stay long, but she asked me to pray for her. She seemed desperate. Anthony's heart skipped a beat. What did she look like? She had dark hair, slender, with a tired look in her eyes, the priest said. The boy looked like her, but there was something about him. What? Anthony asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The priest studied Anthony for a moment. He had your eyes. Anthony felt his knees weaken, and he gripped the edge of the desk for support. Tyler stepped in, his voice steady. Do you know where she went after that? The priest shook his head. She didn't say, but she left in a hurry, almost like she was running from someone. Anthony's mind raced. Noah wasn't just a name on a page anymore. He was real. His son was out there, scared and on the run with Hannah. Tyler placed a hand on his shoulder. We're close, we'll find them. But as they left the church, Anthony couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Across the street, a figure stood near a parked car, their face obscured by a hat and sunglasses. They're still tracking us, Tyler muttered under his breath. Let them, Anthony said, his voice steely. If they're following us, we're getting closer to her. The figure across the street didn't move as Anthony and Tyler left St. Mary's. Anthony kept his gaze forward, but his fists were clenched at his sides, and his steps quickened. They're watching, not acting, Tyler murmured as they turned a corner. That means they're reporting back to Charles. He's tightening the net. I don't care, Anthony said through gritted teeth. We're finding her today. Back in the car, Tyler pulled up a map on his phone. If she's moving around, she'll need supplies. There's only one grocery store within walking distance of the church. It's a small town. Someone there might have seen her. Anthony nodded. Every second felt like an eternity, but Tyler's methodical approach was working. At the grocery store, they showed Hannah's picture to the cashier, a teenage boy with headphones dangling around his neck. Yeah, I've seen her, he said, popping a bubble of gum. She came in a couple days ago. Had a kid with her. They bought a ton of canned stuff, like they were stocking up for something. Anthony's chest tightened. Did she say anything? Where she might have been going? Nah, she was pretty quiet, the boy said, shrugging. But I saw her talking to Mr. Delaney outside. He's the guy who delivers groceries to the cabins out by the lake. Tyler's eyes narrowed. Where can we find him? He's usually at the diner around this time, the boy replied. At the diner, they found Mr. Delaney, a burly man in his late 50s with a thick grey beard. He listened carefully as Tyler showed him the picture. Yeah, I know her, Delaney said, setting his coffee mug down. She's staying out at cabin 3. Real quiet, keeps to herself. That little boy of hers is a polite kid. Doesn't talk much, though. Anthony felt a surge of relief, but it was quickly replaced by urgency. How far is it? Couple miles down the road by Pine Lake, Delaney said. You can't miss it. The drive to Pine Lake was tense, the air in the car heavy with anticipation. Tyler parked a short distance from the cabins, not wanting to draw attention. The woods were quiet, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. Cabin 3, Tyler whispered, pointing toward a small structure nestled between the trees. Anthony's heart pounded as they approached. He could see the faint glow of light through the curtains and the outline of someone moving inside. When they reached the door, Anthony hesitated, his hand hovering over the wood. For 5 years he had dreamed of this moment, but now that it was here, he felt frozen. Anthony, Tyler said gently, Go." Taking a deep breath, Anthony knocked. The movement inside stopped. There was a pause, then the door creaked open a few inches. Hannah stood there, her face pale and her eyes wide with shock. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Anthony," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's me," he said, his voice breaking. "Hannah, it's me." Tears welled in her eyes as she opened the door wider, revealing a small boy clutching her leg. He had dark hair and eyes that were unmistakably Anthony's. Anthony dropped to one knee, his heart aching as he looked at the boy. "Noah?" he said softly. The boy clung to Hannah, his gaze wary but curious. Hannah knelt beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "Noah," she said gently, "this is your dad." Noah's eyes widened as he looked from Anthony to Hannah, then back again. "Dad?" he asked, his voice small. Anthony nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Yeah, buddy, I'm your dad." Noah hesitated, then took a small step forward. Anthony reached out, his hands trembling as he gently placed them on the boy's shoulders. In that moment, the weight of the past 5 years seemed to lift. For the first time in a long time, Anthony felt whole. Their reunion was short-lived. Tyler, standing guard near the edge of the clearing, suddenly called out, "We've got company." Anthony turned to see 2 black SUVs pulling up the dirt road, their engines loud in the quiet woods. Hannah's face paled. "It's Charles," she whispered. Anthony stood, his jaw tightening. "Take Noah inside, lock the door. Tyler and I will handle this." "Anthony, you can't." "Go," he said firmly, cutting her off. "I won't let him take you again." Hannah hesitated, then scooped Noah into her arms and ran back inside, locking the door behind her. The SUVs came to a stop, and several men in dark suits stepped out, their faces cold and professional. Leading them was Charles Vieira himself, his expression calm but his eyes full of malice. "Anthony," Charles said smoothly, spreading his arms as though greeting an old friend. "I wondered how long it would take you to find her." Anthony stepped forward, his fists clenched. "This ends now, Charles. I'm taking them and you're never seeing them again." Charles chuckled darkly. "You think you can just walk away? After everything I've done to protect her? To protect my reputation?" "You didn't protect her," Anthony shot back. "You caged her. You tore our lives apart." Charles's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, Anthony, one you won't walk away from." "I've made plenty of mistakes," Anthony said, his voice steady. "But not this time." Charles nodded to his men. "Take him." The first man stepped forward, but before he could reach Anthony, Tyler drew his gun. "Back off," Tyler warned, his voice cold. The standoff was tense, the air crackling with unspoken threats. Anthony stood his ground, ready to fight for his family. Inside the cabin, Hannah held Noah tightly, her heart pounding as the confrontation unfolded. For the first time, she dared to hope that this nightmare might finally be over.